world's hardest problems can't wait. Food security, energy resilience, the digital divide. I'm Astro Teller. For 15 years, I've worked with inventors and engineers to tackle the seemingly impossible. In the Moonshot podcast, we take you inside X, Google's Moonshot Factory, giving you unprecedented access to the messy, exhilarating journey of turning science fiction into reality. This is the Moonshot Podcast, out now wherever you listen.
No Small Endeavor is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations. Hello, friends. Lee Seacamp. You're listening to No Small Endeavor. This is our unabridged interview with Mike Cosper. Many of you may recognize Mike's name as the director of podcast for Christianity Today, and especially as the host of the widely discussed smash hit, so far as podcasts go, of the podcast The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. Mike in this conversation provides a disarming authenticity and straightforwardness, I think, discussing his own hurts, his own difficulties in the work that he's done as a Christian pastor and as an author, and then how to navigate disillusionment and the sorts of questions and practices that sustained him through such difficult times. He also gave me in this interview a new favorite line that I've been trying to find some sort of way to live into from the Moravian missionaries who used to say, "Preach the gospel, die, and be forgotten." It's a sort of call to a humility that I think if I can find my way into, it would be altogether liberating. It resonates as well with a new book from Miroslav Volf that I've not read yet, but I've just read some reviews of and seen released called The Cost of Ambition. It's a sort of treatise on a pursuit of excellence as opposed to ambition and the deep hurt that is caused to our own souls by our ambition. Then, just this weekend, I was talking to a Catholic priest friend of mine who pointed me back to the spiritual exercises of Saint Ignatius, who in his exercises speaks of 3 levels of humility, and just the second level, not even the hardest, not even the most challenging level of humility, but the second level of humility is to learn to care for neither riches nor poverty, and to care not for honor or dishonor. And that, of course, accords nicely with the Enchiridion of Epictetus, that classic of Stoic philosophy I'm sure some of you have heard me discuss if you're a subscriber to our NSC notebook. And if you're not a subscriber to our NSC notebook, why not? Go there quickly, I say, and subscribe today. Just go to nosmallendeavor.com and find there where you can subscribe to the NSC notebook, where we talk about lots of great stuff. In any case, this is a fascinating conversation with Mike Cosper. I hope you enjoy. All the best. Mike Cosper has been creating music, radio shows, and podcasts for more than 20 years. He produced and hosted the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast, and is director of podcast at Christianity Today. He now co-hosts a weekly podcast called The Bulletin, as well as Cultivated, a podcast about faith and work. Welcome, Mike Cosper.
Hey, it's good to be here.
I'm glad to have you, and I've been looking forward to our conversation. I want to jump right in with something I read that you had said at some point, that at age 16, quote, that you had, quote, a real encounter with the power of the gospel and the presence of God, a kind of Damascus Road experience, end quote. Are you open to discussing that any?
Yeah, for sure. What do you want to know?
What was that like? What did it entail?
So it's funny. So it was actually at a Christian concert. The band, it was this band named Johnny Q. Public. For people who were CCM children of the 90s, this was a band on Goatee Records, and just a really great rock band out of St. Louis. And I was not very into Christian music. I always had kind of I was the kind of kid that grew up listening to Nirvana and Stone Temple Pilots and Pearl Jam and all that. I love that kind of world, and CCM world had like facsimiles of it, but not great versions of it necessarily for a long time anyway. And anyway, so but my brother actually gave me this record. He was like, "I think you'd actually like this one," and I did. And long story short, I end up at a concert of theirs. And in the middle of this concert, the lead singer of the band goes into like a long kind of testimony, sermon, whatever. And again, here I was, a 15-year-old kid. I found myself kind of cut to the heart, like the scripture says, right? Like, and I remember in particular him just talking about the meaning of the cross itself. Like, have you dealt with the reality of what the cross says about who you are and who God is? And it wrecked me. It really wrecked me. And I remember there was this moment where there was this moment where I realized I was literally on my hands and knees on the floor of this random church where this random band was playing, and I got self-conscious about like, dude, what are you doing? Like, I mean, I was wrecked. I was sobbing, and I opened my eyes and looked around and realized the entire room was on its knees. I mean, there was something happening in that moment that felt like, for me, the only way I can interpret it is to say, like, it felt like the Spirit of God was just sort of poured out on that room in some way. And it's hard to describe. It's when I hear the story now, I look back on it and go, well, is that what it was? But I can't get away from it, that being kind of what it was. It was this really incredible experience where the story of the cross and resurrection was made real for me. And it changed my life. It changed the trajectory of my life. The funny thing was, when I went with my brother to that show. I really didn't know anybody else in that entire room. And I came to find out years later, I did ministry in Louisville for many years and all this. So many of the people who would become my closest friends in the years that followed were in that room at the same time and had similar experiences of just kind of being blown away by that that testimony, that story.
How have you thought about that process of your subsequent asking yourself about what that experience was? Because I think, I'm from a very rationalistic sort of Christian tradition. And so any sort of non-rational or mystical, we were trained to be very suspicious of. But right. I've had a few of those through the years. And then I find myself doing the same sort of thing about what was that, right? How do I make sense of that? And I think that there is this sort of, for me, the sort of element of I'm really invited to choose how I'm going to frame that experience. Right. That's in some ways this is a frightening kind of reality, but it's a sort of subjective choice, maybe an existential choice, which then is going to have a profound impact upon the way I frame the rest of my life. But I don't know, how have you thought about interpretation of such experiences?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we do. I think so much of our lives and so much of the way we sort of try to grasp for sanity is like, what's the story we tell ourselves about ourselves?
Yeah.
And how do we narrate a story that kind of makes sense of our world? I'm working on a project right now where I keep coming back to Joan Didion's line that, we tell ourselves stories in order to live. I think that's really true. And I think there's a cynical lens there. And I think that's certainly the way Didion meant it. But I also just think that's also the kinds of creatures that we are. There's a great book by Jonathan Gottschall called The Storytelling Animal. And he sort of looks at like evolutionary biology and cultural biology and trying to think about like, why did man become a creature that was a storytelling creature? And part of his conclusion is this idea that basically like stories are survival information, right? Like it's a brilliant trait for us to have, that if I can go out hunting tomorrow and I run into a saber-toothed tiger that's in this cave, if I've evolved the ability to come back to my tribe and say, hey, just so you know, when you're over by this cliff over there, I was there today and I encountered a saber-toothed tiger and here's how I got away. So, so you're able to sort of pass along this information that makes everybody better, or it makes the species better. That's sort of the evolutionary frame. as a Christian, I have a slightly different way of kind of getting into that, but I do think there's something to it. I do think there's something to this idea that stories are survival information and the stories we tell ourselves are survival information. And I think that because I have seen the story of the gospel and the concept of grace be so life-giving for so long now, I grew up in the church, so basically my whole life I've been around it. I can't get away from the idea that that it's the story that works. It's the story that makes sort of the most sense of everything else. And so, so I look back on those moments, and definitely there are times where you go, how real was that? And you question it, but at the same time, I don't know how to make sense of the world without it.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Not too many years after that, then you become a key player in helping plant a church in Louisville called Sojourn Church. Sojourn.
Mm-hmm.
And then were there for 15 years, and your recent book, Land of My Sojourn, subtitled The Landscape of a Faith Lost and Found, the unfolding of a story of a lot of grief and pain that occurs after 15 years there. How would you kind of encapsulate kind of the major narrative moves of the story that you tell there?
Yeah, so I was part of this church. Really had just a number of just incredible experiences there, and deep friendships, deep community, and then there was this sort of our church ran into what a lot of churches that were planted around the same time or were sort of growing around the same time ran into, which was just a culture, a leadership culture that got really, really unhealthy. And a leader that was really, I think, sort of untethered from the right kind of accountability and restraints. And so it when you're in that situation, it leads to a number of things. It leads to burnout, leads to exhaustion, leads to a lot of conflict. And for me personally, it led to my exit from the church. Now, I thought I was going to work for that church until I retired. I thought I'd do it until I was 65, and it led to my exit in 2015, and then there were a solid several, 4 or 5 years of trying to sort of figure out, okay, how do I make sense of this whole experience? Because it was so good when it was good, and it was so bad and painful when it was bad. And I think a big reason I wrote the book and shared my perspective is I think that I think that a lot of what I experienced was normal. And I think the burnout of the Christian life, I think the exhaustion of the Christian life at times, arriving at a place in midlife where you go, well, this doesn't make sense, this doesn't work. We tend to kind of demonize it and go, well, something must be wrong with your faith if that's kind of where you've landed. But I think both in terms of the Christian tradition, on both the Protestant and the Catholic side, but also in terms of the stories of the Bible, these kind of moments of despair are pretty common, pretty normal. And it seems to me that it's the case that Christians find themselves there because it's a moment in where God is exposing a lot of false assumptions and a lot of really a lot of presumption that needs to be kind of broken down to get to a place of deeper wisdom and growth.
I want to come back to some of what you raised there at the end of that those comments, but before we get there, I understand that you were informed that you were no longer going to be a part of the church by being shown an org chart in which you were not on the chart.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
What do you do? What do you do with that?
It's I have this problem, and I really mean this as it's like a weird flaw for me. I found it's true in my life in a lot of different places. Like, I don't know someone's insulting me until well after the fact. So I'll go through these conversations and I'll walk away from it and I'll look back on it, a few hours or a few days later and go, wait, they were really coming after me there. Like they were really being insulting to me there. And I don't know what that is. I'm sure my therapist could probably unpack that for me. But in the moment, what my brain jumped to was not how do I confront what's happening right now, but how do I survive? Like, what do I do in this moment to get to the place where I know my well-being, my family, our livelihood, all that kind of stuff? Like, how do I solve for that? And so I was trying to think like 3 or 4 steps ahead rather than just sort of address what was right in front of me. And frankly, this is one of the things that's really pernicious about spiritual abuse is spiritual abuse. Spiritual abuse thrives because it depends on people assuming the best about the abuser. And that was the case for me even in that moment to kind of go, well, they must think this is the best thing for the church. And so, it felt like, so I had the choice of like arguing with them about what was best for the church or trying to position myself to make sure that like, that I'm not like on the unemployment line, tomorrow, as opposed to 3 months from now or 6 months from now or whatever the situation was. So, yeah, I mean, I know that's not a great answer, but that's what it was.
If I keep thinking about what you said about spiritual abuse thrives out of a context in which one assumes the best about the abuser. So how do you think, having learned that lesson, how does one navigate not becoming a overly critical cynic that's always assuming the worst about somebody while trying to hold at the same time a sort of trust of one's fellows that makes community possible?
It's I don't think there's an easy answer to that question. I mean, I feel like even just saying that feels like a cop out, but I think what you have to do is I'll put it this way. I know in my own life, I oscillate between kind of 2 poles. At one end is the pole that is way too trusting and feeds into that or leans into that instinct to kind of trust at all costs, give people the benefit of the doubt, all the rest. And then the other end is the skeptical end. And that's the end that makes, where I want to pull away. And I guess I would say like what I've found is so valuable for me is having a handful of friendships that have endured all kinds of circumstances and are much broader than all of this. Because when I'm leaning into being too cynical, my cynicism isn't ever going to break those relationships, those friendships. Because some of them are 35 years long, and at the same time, it's like a good friend can always kind of help root you back into the earth when the time comes. But that's I don't feel like that's a helpful answer either, because friendship is so darn hard in these days, and people are transient. We move. We don't know how to be good friends. We don't know how to encourage each other and connect. So that's easy to say, and I genuinely feel like it's the greatest source of grace in my life. Is I was saying to somebody the other day, like, I have a text thread that's about, we share about all kinds of different stuff on it, but it's primarily things like movies, music, whatever. It's the same 6 guys that would have been texting each other about movies, music, television shows when I was 16 years old. Like, these were my close friends then as well. And that's really rare. Like, it's extremely rare that people have that, but I do have it, and I'm grateful for it. And I think that does keep me from getting too cynical at any point, because a friendship has a way of rooting you in the earth.
Yeah. In talking about that, that season, you said that you've lamented, quote, deceived and corrupted imaginations, end quote, within and without the church. Tell us more what you mean by that.
Yeah, I think what happens a lot of times in evangelicalism, and the kind of evangelicalism that I've been a part of, is that we really get a vision for like what is the kingdom of God. We get a really narrow division of it.
Mm-hmm.
So I've become very, one place I've become very skeptical is things like church mission statements. When you hear churches saying things like, man, we're going to do X, Y, and Z so that we can reach the city. And if we reach the city, we'll reach the nation. And if we reach the nation, we'll go to the nations, to the ends of the earth. And I just constantly find myself going like, I don't think that's your job. I think you're thinking too grandiose. Like you've become too grandiose about what your actual responsibility is as a local church. Certainly, it's the mission of the church, capital C church, to bring the gospel to the four corners of the world and all of that. And I'm a historical optimist on the way the role of the church in history and all of that. But I think that I think that what the church growth movement kind of did was, number one, it discovered how to move masses, right? Like the church growth movement is an assimilation of marketing techniques that figured out how do we connect to masses and move them and assimilate them into our culture, and then get them to then repeat, rinse and repeat and grow. And so, suddenly you've got churches, these multi-site churches, 40,000 people, 15 locations, and ever onward and ever upward. And you mentioned I did this Mars Hill thing. I mean, the vision of the Mars Hill, the internal vision for Mars Hill, just before it kind of fell in on itself, was a church of 100,000 people, and that wasn't pie in the sky. Like they had a plan. They knew how they were going to do it. And I think if Driscoll hadn't derailed on his own character, they probably would have gotten there. So all of that, to me, I mean, I look at all of that and I just wonder how much have we confused what's essentially like success in terms of treating people like masses and marketing to them and mobilizing them for a cause. How much have we confused that with discipleship, conversion, repentance, the things that sort of mark what the Christian life in a more traditional sense. And look, I think God works in the midst of all kinds of churches and all kinds of circumstances. It's not that I'm saying like I think God's absent from all of that. I don't think he is at all. I think God's wonderfully kind of pluralistic in that sense, that he'll show up wherever there's an open door. But I think the church has definitely wasted a lot of resources and energy. And I think some of what we've seen in the last number of years with Christians, with kind of the ex-evangelical phenomenon and all this, you're seeing a lot of disillusionment that's rooted in people who feel like the church has sort of overpromised and underdelivered about what the Christian life was and what it offered.
So you come back. A couple of kind of two things I want to unpack here. One, you say you go through a kind of a season of disillusionment, maybe grappling with your own faith, and then you come back to the church. At that actual particular local church that you come back to be a member of?
In a way, we never really left. I mean, we were always kind of around it. There were definitely moments where we considered, is it time to move on? Should we look somewhere else? But at the end of the day, we just felt like this was again, so a lot of it came back to the friendships thing too. Yeah. Like there were some relationships there that we didn't want to let go of, and we haven't.
So in that season, not long after your dismissal, was this mostly for you a frustration with the lived experience of church, or did this translate into a sort of questioning your own sense of faith? Or both?
It definitely went beyond, the church. It was definitely more a questioning of the faith itself. And like one way that I've talked about it is that there's a sense in which it's I think there's a sense in which a lot of times people are looking at Christianity and saying, is it true? And in fact, like as a kid, I feel like that was the main way. That was the main way the church tried to sort of do its evangelism thing, right? Like, is it true? You know, you got the evidence that demands a verdict and the case for Christ and all this kind of stuff, where it's like, let's give people kind of the forensic analysis that shows that Christianity is true and reliable in these ways. I think where I landed after my own negative experiences was asking, is it good, right? Like, is it a force for good in the world? And if it is a force for good in the world, where, like, what's made it go so astray that it's become so hurtful and damaging, not just to me, but to many, many people. And I feel like I personally have answered that question to where I do feel that it's, you know, profoundly good and all of that. But I think that is, in a way, like vocationally, that's kind of also what I've been trying to ask on behalf of Christians that are trying to make sense of our moment. Is it good? Like, what is good about Christianity? What's good about the gospel? And how do we hold up Jesus, you know, to use Tim Keller's phrase, how do we hold up Jesus as beautiful and believable in a time when a lot of people are calling that into question?
Hello, friends. I am pleased to tell you about an organization that's close to my heart, the Rabbit Room, an incredible arts ministry right here in Nashville, Tennessee, that connects artists, resources, and communities to integrate art and creativity into every facet of life. They publish books, produce plays and concerts, create articles and podcasts, and put on events, all for the flourishing of Christ-centered communities. Discover your next favorite book or podcast, get tickets to an upcoming event, or explore their vast library of content at rabbitroom.com. When I first asked you to start talking about this season with this church sojourn, and you described the kind of sense of pain and disillusionment that you ended up processing, and you noted how that's a sort of common, perhaps, experience, somewhat to be expected. And so I would like to dig into that just a little bit. And at one point you said, in this case, I wanted to make sure that without minimizing what we went through, I put the preponderance of the blame on my own expectations. Talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of what I talk about in the book, I use Peter as an example. And, you know, Peter as a character, like, preachers love to kind of beat up on him and say, like, oh, you know, here's this guy, he's brash, he speaks before he thinks, and he, you know, all of this kind of stuff. And I actually, the more I've been through the journey that I've been on, the more I look at Peter and go, I actually think Peter is all of us. Like, the whole purpose of him, particularly in the book of John, his whole role is basically to say what we are thinking in any given moment. And that's what I think makes, you know, the only thing that's different between him and us is that he's got the boldness to actually say it and to do it. And so the moment in the book, and the Land of My Sojourn opens with this story, like the moment in his life that I think is maybe the most insightful is when he's on, you know, the top of Mount Tabor with just a couple other disciples and with Jesus, and Jesus, it's the moment of the transfiguration. And all of a sudden Jesus starts glowing in the dark, and, you know, he finds himself, you know, there with Elijah and Moses. And what I think about with Peter in that moment is, like, this is a guy who, from the time he could walk, and from the time his first memories were formed, he was hearing these stories about Moses and Elijah, these characters that you know, one of them conquers the Holy Land, the other one cleanses it of an occupier and of corruption, you know, the corrupted religion, which was what Elijah was about. And he's living there, and he's living under Roman occupation, and the people of Israel have been humiliated for, you know, 600 years, And he's desperately hoping and praying for this redemption that's going to come, where they're going to be set free. And that's the picture of it. And his reaction to seeing Moses and Elijah appear on the mountain next to Jesus is he walks up and he says, the text actually says, Lord, this is a great moment. Shall I build tabernacles for us so that we can stay here? And it's almost a childlike response, right? Like, wow, this is incredible. Can we just stay? Can we make this last? How long can we make this last? And I think for many of us that are Christians, we've been through seasons in life where if we could have pressed a button and made things, sort of frozen everything in time so that nothing changed, right? Like you think about those moments in your life where the marriage was good, the family was good, the church relationships were good, work, whatever it was. If you could freeze time from that moment, you would have wanted to do that. And of course, what happens in the story is basically the moment he says that, Jesus stops glowing, Moses and Elijah are gone, they're going down the mountain, and the next thing they encounter is a child who's been having seizures, tormented by demons and having seizures its entire life and throwing itself into a fire. So he goes from this moment of glory to this encounter with like walking death, right? And but he doesn't recognize the way those two things are connected. And he doesn't and he hasn't processed fully yet that Jesus is telling him, I'm going to Jerusalem to die. So anyway, so I think that's when I talk about our false expectations, I think we're all kind of like that. Like we have we go through, especially our early years in the Christian life. And when I say years, I mean decades of the Christian life with just a grand sense of optimism about changing the world and everything else. And many, many Christians these days are finding themselves, people like me find themselves at midlife and they go, man, it felt like we were going to change the world. And right now it feels like we've fallen flat on our faces. And I don't know how to reconcile those things anymore. The temptation is to lash out and to blame everyone around us. And I think that's where you see some of the kind of deconstruction phenomenon. Oh, the problem is the theology. The problem is the institution. The problem is whatever. And that may be the case. Like there may be issues. There's, that's a conversation probably worth having to a certain extent. But what I wanted to kind of press into in the book is to say, well, what about our own expectations? What about, and what role does that play? And you just have so many examples in the Bible of characters who had to rethink their expectations. And that's exactly how Peter's story ends. Peter's story ends on a beach in the Sea of Galilee with Jesus, where Jesus basically telling him, look, you thought you were going to be a warrior and a conqueror, and I'm telling you there's going to come a day when somebody binds your hands and takes you where you don't want to go, like meaning you're going to get crucified, which he does. And it's wisdom is recognizing that that way, that path of what is it that Eugene Peterson called it, like the path of descent. That's the better way, and because it's the way what you find in that path of descent is communion with God, and once you find that, that's the pearl of great price, right? Like that's the thing that you sell everything for, and including your own life.
That notion of the wisdom of the path of descent, and there you allude to that as the pearl of great price, which kind of gives it in the hierarchy of wisdoms, maybe the top of the heap, right? As far as wisdom is concerned, are there other bits of wisdom or practices that you've learned through this process that you have wanted to hold on to or have needed to hold on to continue on the path that you're on?
Yeah, I think one of the big ones is I really love this idea of it's a phrase I've been throwing around a little bit. This idea of mere church, right? that C.S. Lewis talked about mere Christianity as this sort of this way of thinking about Christianity that was sort of boiled to its essentials, and what does it, So I think with the church, to go back to something we were talking about earlier, we're so tempted to grandiosity, and I think pastors are tempted to grandiosity for two reasons. One is that we live in a culture of narcissism, and we think that we're wonderful. Like, we're raised to think we're wonderful and that we're going to change the world. So I think that's one reason that they do that. But the other reason that I think pastors are tempted to grandiosity is because they're really, really worried that people aren't going to come. And when they do come, that they're not going to stick around. Mm-hmm. So we got to promise them a lot. Mm-hmm. And I like I said, I've been thinking about this idea of mere church in the sense that, is there a way for us to start talking about the Christian life, the Christian faith, life in community with one another, that doesn't overpromise anymore? One of my favorite lines from a movie. There's this scene in Midnight in Paris where the main character Gil, he's been traveling back in time to the 1920s in Paris, and partying with all these different people, and it's he's had this kind of, he's been kind of addicted to nostalgia and thinking that, man, it would be so much better if I was in this moment. And then at one point, he and one of these characters from the 20s go back in time to the Belle Epoque, like 30 years earlier, the 1890s or whatever, and she's just swept up in it in that moment. And watching her get swept up makes him realize, oh, this is what I'm doing. And he says two things that I love. He basically says, nostalgia is not a solution for any of this stuff. I mean, these people don't have antibiotics, and then he says, maybe we walk around in our lives a little bit disappointed because life is disappointing. And I almost want to figure out, like, okay, how do we make that the church's mission statement, right? Like, what does it mean to worship God in the midst of a life that is always going to be a little bit disappointing? Until the resurrection, right? And until the restoration of all things that we read about in, the apocalypse of John. And I don't know what that looks like. That doesn't sell, right? That's the problem. But it's the truth. And so maybe it would sell, or maybe it would be effective, because at the end of the day, I do think people want something that's true, and I think they're tired of being oversold. Mm. They're being oversold.
Yeah. You mentioned the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast, and a smash hit as far as podcasts go. How do you see the work? Well, let me ask a first question to introduce that first. For those who are unfamiliar with that podcast, could you give us a little more overview of what you do in that series?
Yeah, so 1996, a pastor, a young guy in his 20s named Mark Driscoll, planted a church in Seattle called Mars Hill. And between 96 and 2014, it grew to 15,000 people, 12 to 15,000 people, depending on whose numbers inside the church you believe. Gosh, I haven't thought about this in a minute. I think it was 13 locations at the end, or 14 locations at the end. But all around the country, from Seattle to Albuquerque. They were looking at sites in Australia and New England. They had a strategy where they were looking at growing to 100,000 over the next decade. And then there was a series of controversies that kind of erupted in the last couple of years there. Part of what's interesting about the controversies, normally when you hear pastor and controversy, it's they stole money, or they were having, they were sleeping with women in the church, or there was some big theological controversy. They made some theological leap that put them out of alignment with their denomination or whatever. None of that happened at Mars. I mean, there was some financial stuff, but even that was complicated and not necessarily. He wasn't stealing money for sure. And yet there was controversy around him as just kind of being domineering, being a bully, and the culture of the church being incredibly unhealthy and damaging. And as that controversy erupted, the pastor, Mark Driscoll, resigned, and basically within 3 months, the church closed its doors. A church of 15,000 people sort of evaporates overnight with the collapse of, with the exit of the pastor. So I wanted to tell that story to help us understand what are we seeing with the, I didn't use the language cult of personality necessarily, I think, in the show, but I mean, that's kind of what, there definitely was an element of that. And what does this story tell us about the church more broadly? And I think it turns out it tells us quite a bit.
So tell us a little bit more about what some of the, perhaps the danger of making too much, reducing it too much to the moral of the story, but what are some of the morals of the story that are takeaways for you?
Yeah, the Moravian missionaries had a motto where that was "Preach the gospel, die, and be forgotten." And I love that motto. I think there's something kind of beautiful and inspiring about it in the sense that you're giving your life away to something that matters, and that is the polar opposite of the way we approach ministry in our day and age. Because our day, in our moment, it's get a platform, get an audience, and then give them some gospel if you can, right? We've so sort of confused the categories of like celebrity and fame, such that it's, no one. Billy Graham became famous because his ministry was so effective. But part of what it seems like we see a lot with celebrity pastors these days is that people become celebrities, and if we're lucky, it turns out that they are good men and they have virtue, and there's a legacy that follows them afterwards. But that's getting the process backwards, like in terms of the sort of historic understanding of like what makes a person great, what makes a person famous. It's they've done great things. Social media culture, celebrity culture, everything like that. It's inverted this thing, and to the point where we actually train pastors, we train leaders to do it that way, to worry about audience, to worry about their reach more than necessarily having something profound and interesting to say that stirs people and transforms their lives. And so what I think the lesson of Mars Hill, though, is just the incredible danger of to borrow another biblical metaphor, building your house on that particular kind of sand. Because to me, the tragedy of Mars Hill is that when you hear the story and when you listen to the podcast, you find all these people who now, a decade later, are looking back and saying, this was the most important experience of my life. These were the best friendships I ever had. These were the deepest relationships I ever had. I had this incredible sense of purpose and meaning being a part of this community. And then it just went away, it just vanished. And it vanished because it was built around a single individual who was willing to kind of burn it all down when he couldn't get his way anymore. And that's horrific to realize in terms of what that actually sort of does to people's psyches and to their faith and everything else. So I think there's a real burden for the church, and I don't think the church has learned the lesson yet, but I think they're getting there. I think the question's going to keep being asked.
Yeah.
How do we root people in a faith that's more stable than this? Because the flip side of it is this: if Mark Driscoll had gotten run over by a bus in 2014 instead of having to leave and step down, the exact same thing would have happened to that church. It would have still collapsed. Lots of those people would no longer be going to church anymore because their bond was with him and not actually with the community, and not actually with a deeply rooted faith that provided all of that meaning, purpose, everything else.
So having done all that work and to tell that story well, what have become like warning signs to you that if you see X, Y, or Z, the yellow warning light starts flashing?
Yeah, I mean, so I have kind of like a a funny answer to that, and then serious answers. But they're all serious answers in a certain sense. One is, I get suspicious the second I go to a church's website and the pastor's face is on the front page, right? And part of what's funny about Driscoll is Driscoll had actually told his leaders for years, if he'd actually told some of his leaders, if we ever get to the point where I'm saying put my face on the front page of the website, you should fire me because I've become compromised. And then of course, 2012, front and center, Mark Driscoll, his face. But I think that's a good, that's a very specific example that gives you kind of the broader picture. What are we building this church on? What is the point around which people are really gathering? And if they're, again, if you're gathering around a personality, I think that's a real problem. Relatedly, the other thing that I think about, so another book I wrote, I'm not trying to hawk my books, but another thing I talk about in this book, The Church in Dark Times, which is really it's actually looking at the political theory of Hannah Arendt as a way to understand what's going on in the church right now. And the big concept that I push in that book is this idea that the church has confused its mission with modern ideology. And in particular, it's this idea, ideology is this little idea that can change everything. And what we find in the church so often, particularly kind of in the post-church growth era, which is this very modern post-Enlightenment phenomenon, is people they gather around not necessarily just the gospel, not necessarily just the story of Jesus born, died, and resurrected, but this idea that if we can just get this one idea right, we can change the world. Mm-hmm. And like in Mars Hill, it was reach young men. Young men cause 99% of the world's problems. If you reach young men, we can reach the city, we can change the world. And the corrupting power of that, and Mars is a great example of it, the corrupting power of that is once you realize that changing young men will quote unquote fix everything, then it becomes this black hole, or becomes this gravitational force that twists your theology, it twists your morals, it twists the story you tell. The church becomes suddenly very, very misogynist. The church becomes very sort of morally flexible around the ways we talk about sex, the ways we talk about women, the ways we talk about all these different things. And because ultimately, the ends justify the means. Because reaching young men as an ends justifies whatever's necessary in sort of moral twisting and compromising to get to them, to get to the ends. And but you see it in a examples. I mean, the parallel example that's really interesting like this is Willow Creek and Bill Hybels, who really believed the problem was the church didn't have leaders and leadership. And he builds this massive global leadership organization to run parallel to the church. Because he really believed if we can make leaders, we can change the world. We can solve everything. And then there's a whole story of sort of corrupting influence inside Willow Creek related to that.
You alluded here to notions of masculinity. How out of that storytelling have you framed for yourself thinking about masculinity?
Man, what a good question. I think about this all the time, and I'm kind of obsessed with this question right now because I do think, there is a ton of data to show that we are in a moment where there's a real masculinity crisis in our country, in our country as a whole, and in our world, and then in the church too. What's undeniable about Mark was particularly at that time, because I think he's become a bit of a caricature of himself now. But what was so clear back then and at the time was this ability to talk about manhood, fatherhood, being a husband in a way that what's the David Foster Wallace has this line, we're all dying to give ourselves away to something. And that was what he did with masculinity that was so compelling, was that being a man meant giving yourself away to like provide for your family, protect your family, to love them, to sacrifice for them. Now, it came with some real ugly misogynistic stuff that sort of evolved under it. But what's wild is if you go back and you talk to men who were a part of Mars Hill, none of that was the main thing for them. In fact, they all kind of rolled their eyes at Mark's dumb comments about, your wife should make you nachos and wear stripper heels or whatever. Like they all thought that stuff was really pretty stupid. What drew them in, though, was this idea that being a man meant following Jesus into self-sacrifice for your beloved. And guys would line up. I mean, they'd line up around the block to sort of give themselves away to something like that. I think what's interesting in where we are right now is that what's attracting men to, the culture that's attracting young men right now is the polar opposite of that. It's a culture of what's in it for me. So it's the Andrew Tate thing of being a man is about conquest and seduction. Elon Musk, being a man is about spreading your seed as far and wide as you possibly can. It's about consumption. It's about it's about like when you get into like the Andrew Huberman world, who I don't have a problem with Huberman. I think Huberman's doing some interesting and good things. But when you get into kind of the Andrew Huberman, Tim Ferriss, to some extent to the Joe Rogan thing, there's this much more narcissistic orientation of how do I get as fit as possible, extend my life as long as possible, work as little as necessary, make as much money as I possibly can. Like it's all self-seeking and self-determining. And, and it's been really effective. I mean, these guys have massive, massive audiences. And I think some of it is we just don't know what to do with men. We don't know what to do with men in our culture. And at the same time that there is this kind of weird crisis where we don't know how to talk about men, we beat up on men a ton and right, post Me Too, rightly so at times and all of that. But at the same time that's happening, we also see, the sociological data that shows that the absence of stable male presences in the lives of young people, how just disastrous that is across the board. That data is getting clearer and clearer and clearer, and people on the right and the left are talking about it more, going, man, what, 4 decades of social experimentation where we basically said, fathers were interchangeable with sort of any influence whatsoever, has proven profoundly wrong. And we don't know how to kind of recover from it.
Any last, before we move to our closing bit of conversation, any last lessons learned for you that you carry with you out of the experience of doing the Mars Hill podcast?
Yeah, I think the main thing that I come back to about thinking about Mars Hill is one of the things the Mars Hill thing really did for me as a journalist was it made me want to make sure and be very careful to let people tell their stories and whatever else it is that I do. I didn't know this going into it, but when I went into making that series, people were there were some people who knew me well that were ready to sort of jump in and talk to me. And there were a lot of people who were highly opposed to talking to me at all, who then came around later. And once they started to hear the show or talk to other people that I was doing interviews with and whatnot, that they came around. For the members of Mars Hill and for the leaders who had been kind of close to the top and involved, their experience when Mars Hill fell apart was one of two things. It was either people just talking about Mark, or it was people caricaturing them. Like how gullible do you have to be to have gotten caught up into this guy's shtick for 2 decades? Where for them, I mean, I'll never forget Paul Petrie, who's one of the most, unjustly abused guys in that whole story, in that whole church. Paul still saying, almost 2 decades after it happened to him, those were the best years of my life. And so there was a real burden for me in that story. And what I really tried to do, and just to whatever extent I did it, I'm grateful that I had the ability to let those people describe that experience for themselves, and to humanize it. Because the fact is that most people who are cynics about Mars Hill, had you been in the shoes of any of those people that did get sucked into it, you'd have been right there with them.
So how, as somebody who's doing regular commentary on the Christian world in America, what is the predominant kind of bellwethers, or what's the predominant anchors for some sort of stability that you're holding on to or trying to navigate in the time in which we find ourselves?
What do you mean? Are you saying like what am I guess, are you asking me how do I stay sane through all of this? Is that what you're asking?
Let's start with that. How are you staying sane with a Christian world so riddled with difficulties in the moment in which we find ourselves?
I'm not sure I entirely am staying sane. Just being honest. I do feel like, to quote Maria Bamford, every day I wake to a fresh nightmare. But that's literal. Like, that's every day you wake up and you flip on Twitter and it's like, what happened overnight? And it's you find yourself just kind of jaw dropped. I won't get into specifics, but even as we talk today, there was something that was posted overnight by our president that I look at and I just think I don't understand. I literally don't understand the world we live in, where the leader of the free world is making comments that I believe are just so immoral and reckless the way that he is. Now, I say this as somebody who's like politically very, very conservative, like sort of shockingly conservative to a lot of my friends at times. But I really feel like we've entered a moment where the lines between sort of liberal and conservative don't account for what's actually going on with our politics anymore, because the primary dividing lines inside both parties now are lines between sort of the pluralists and the populists. And the populist ethos is the thing that I think is extremely dangerous and historically has led to just a lot of harm, a lot of damage. So how do I stay sane? Well, a couple of things. One is I love I'm amateur history guy. Like I love history, and staying rooted in history helps a lot. Because when you hear people railing about, oh, we're on our way to fascism, Trump is Hitler, like this kind of stuff, like go read about what happened in Germany between 1933 and 1939. We're not there yet. We're a long way away from that. Now, there are people who want to take us there. I don't think Trump particularly wants to take us there. There are people around him who would like him to and like to enable him to, and all of that. But it point being that I think history sobers us up a bit from some of the alarmism. It also simultaneously I do think it helps you in terms of knowing what to actually freak out about. And so for me personally right now, there's a lot happening that I feel like our media is flipping out over. That's concerning and troublesome. For instance, like what's going on with Doge, where I think if you look at history tells us the courts are going to intervene because that's their job, is to stop that kind of thing. So maybe we don't need to lose our minds for that. Now, the war in Ukraine and what unchecked aggression from Russia with aspirations to move westward, what does that mean? Well, history tells us like that's really bad, and that kind of aspiration, when it's unchecked, usually does mean a lot of bloodshed. And so, if there's anything I'm particularly concerned about right now, it's what happens to the global order rather than what happens with Doge tomorrow morning. Mm-hmm. So that's maybe more than what you were looking for.
Yeah, no, it's very helpful. So last question on that. What do you do to simply maintain enough mental order or discipline to keep doing productive work each day rather than getting overwhelmed?
Couple things. One is I have a fantastic dog, and he doesn't care what's going on anywhere else. He just wants to eat, and he doesn't even. He's too old to really do much in terms of like going for long walks or anything like that. But there's to me, there's just something about having dogs that just sort of like when people say like go touch grass, like get a dog. Like getting a dog is perpetually touching grass. So that's I do credit my sanity to my dog to a certain extent. I also just think, this is where, if I can get a little theological for a second, like this is where liturgical theology really matters for the church. In the traditional Mass, there's this moment right as the Eucharist is being served, where the priest says, "Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again." And the whole notion then is that when we gather at the Lord's table, what we're doing is we're sort of standing in this moment that's really kind of suspended in time. It's like this incredible past, present, future. It's all present at once. And I remember Jeremy Begbie saying that it's he called it an echo of the future. When you stand at communion, because it's the meal Christ served, but it's also the meal we will all share together, when all things are made new and restored. And so I do think there's just something essential about both literally, going to church and being sort of rooted in that story, but also just more, back to where our conversation began, just kind of narratively being rooted in that story. And having a sense that, whatever else might be going on in the world around us, we've got a kind of assurance about the ultimate ends to these things. That's very hopeful, regardless of how weird things get. It's a very hopeful set of promises that we do all that with. So that more than anything else, that's the thing that keeps me from getting too off the rails in a very strange time.
I'm talking to Mike Cosper, produced and hosted the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast, currently the director of podcast at Christianity Today. Mike, thanks so much for the great conversation. Thanks for your good work in the world.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Hello, friends. One of the things I've taught students for many years now is that one of the most important things they can do is pay attention to their meta habits, big habits that leave lots of things in their wake, and that this is key to living life well. For centuries, the cardinal virtues were thought of as just such meta habits, profound practices that have a disproportionately large impact upon your life. The four cardinal virtues: courage, temperance, prudence, and justice. They were considered essential to a good life, but today we hardly talk about them. Most people can't even name them. That's why we're launching a special 4-part series exclusively on NSE+. In this series, I'll take a deep dive into these virtues, what they mean, why they matter, and how they shape a meaningful life. Think of it like a private college course, except it's way practical. Episode 1 on courage is out now. We explore why courage is not fearlessness, but the ability to face fear wisely, and how practicing courage can change your life. Join us on NSE Plus to start listening today. Sign up at nosmallendeavor.com and click Join NSE Plus. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible: Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Carrie Harmon, Jason Cheesley, Audrey Griffith, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.
From PRX.